Welcome to the Sound of Economics. I'm Antonia Parat.
And I'm Bryn Watkins.
We're pleased to bring you this podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank specialized in economics and economic policy. Each episode explores one of Europe's big economic policy debates. We'll discuss why it's important and explore some of the work that Bruegel researchers have done in the area. Today, we're going to talk about decarbonization and the fight against climate change. Decarbonization is at the heart of EU energy and climate policy, and the recent ratification of the Paris Agreement makes decarbonization targets some of the EU's most important international commitments. The EU launched its first climate package in 2007 with a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% before the year 2020. This package was recently updated, and now the EU has a long-term vision to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. As a first step towards this, the EU has adopted a binding target of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030, again compared to 1990.
So, how is the EU coordinating its member states as they try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What progress has been made, and what challenges lie ahead? First of all, we're going to hear from Simone Tagliapietra, a research fellow here at Bruegel. Simone has published research on topics like the security of Europe's gas supply and energy cooperation in the Mediterranean. We asked Simone what progress the EU has already made towards its climate targets.
According to Eurostat data, the EU has in fact already surpassed its 2020 greenhouse gas emission targets in 2014. So this means that we are doing really well on this, but of course the economic crisis was a key ally on this, paradoxically, because due to limited industrial activity, Europe was basically able to meet this reduction target of emissions. As far as renewables are concerned, we are pretty well in line in the EU, where we are lagging behind is energy efficiency, which has been really more tricky to be tackled in comparison to renewables.
So progress towards these 2020 targets has been really quite impressive. But the 2020 framework is now being replaced by new targets. The EU wants an 80 to 95% reduction in emissions by 2050, with an intermediate target of 40% by 2030. We asked Simone what is different about these new targets, and whether we can see tensions within the EU.
The point here to be outlined is the fact that this new 2030 framework is not binding at national level, but only at the EU-wide level. This is in contrast to the 2020 previous package, which was binding also at national level. This change was due to the fact that countries like Eastern European countries and also the UK at the time didn't want these targets to be binding because they didn't want to have interference of the EU in their own national energy policies. And of course, this is putting the new framework into question because the governance of these, it likes pretty weak.
We also spoke with Georg Zachmann, one of Bruegel's senior research fellows. We asked him what he thought about the recent drop in Europe's greenhouse gas emissions, which occurred during a period of weak economic growth. So has the EU really managed to decouple economic activity from greenhouse gas emissions?
There's a number of factors that link greenhouse gas emissions and economic development. And in the past, we have seen kind of a mix of three main effects. We have seen external factors at work. So we've seen the recession in the EU that led to lower industrial production and thereby also to lower emissions. We have also seen some sectoral shift in the EU away from energy-intensive production, which is also carbon-intensive, to more service-oriented things. At the second type of factors, we have seen policy factors at work. There, the EU has pushed strongly for renewable energies, which replaced some of the polluting industries or polluting electricity production. And we have seen energy efficiency measures implemented both on the EU level and the member states level. That starts to bite into the energy consumption and hence into carbon emission. At the same time, there have been a number of opposing trends, and the one very important opposing trend has been the increasing share of coal in the electricity mix. So we've seen less gas being burned for producing electricity and more coal, which is much more carbon intensive.
As Europe decarbonizes its economy, getting the right mix of low-carbon energy sources will be vital. We spoke with Laszlo Vada, chief economist at the International Energy Agency. We asked Laszlo which energy sources will be most important and how they can be successfully integrated into power networks.
We shouldn't forget that the largest low-carbon energy source in Europe by far is nuclear power, and the prospects for nuclear power in Europe are not very bright. The second largest low-carbon source in Europe is hydropower, and it's nearly impossible to build a large hydropower plant under realistic political conditions in practically every European country. So the big growth of renewables will have to come from wind and solar. Now, wind and solar is growing. Wind and solar, the costs are coming down. In fact, the cost of wind and solar is no longer an issue. A much more significant issue is the effective integration into the power system. There is a very important technological development not only in the hardware in terms of wind turbines and solar panels, but also what we call the software of the clean energy system, the system level innovations which enable more effective integration. So, for example, the more precise forecasting of future wind and solar power. Some European system operators are world leaders in this. And the average prediction errors of future wind and solar have been cut by half in some cases. So you also need an improvement in physical infrastructure to take advantage of the diverging demand and renewable production patterns. So, for example, you take the two biggest wind producers in Europe, Germany and the United Kingdom. In hours when there is absolutely no wind in the United Kingdom, you have a roughly 50% probability statistically to have good wind in Germany. So with a proper infrastructure integration, you cut the size of the problem by half. Improving the internal electricity infrastructure is very rightly recognized as our policy priority, but nearly every new transmission project is facing a very serious difficulty in terms of licensing and getting the permissions to build. So that is certainly something which should be accelerated.
Total decarbonization cannot rely on the energy sector alone. We spoke with Connie Hedegaard, former European Commissioner for Climate Action, asking her which other sectors need to be prioritized in the fight against climate change.
Well, I think still in transport, it's probably the sector where it's the most difficult, where by and large in Europe and globally, emissions are continuing to sort of go upwards. So I think transport is one of the very big challenges. We have come quite a way in Europe when it comes to the energy sector. And I think industry, sort of heavy industry, they are doing many things. Not that they cannot do more, but they're doing many things. Now we are getting to the more difficult sectors like, for instance, transport and, for instance, agriculture. And that will be the next big challenges to get really serious about how to get emissions down there.
If the EU wants to limit climate change, we need a massive decarbonisation of the European economy. But what concrete steps should the EU take to reach this goal? We asked Georg about the path ahead.
In terms of innovation, the EU has been a front runner in many technology areas, and it should continue to do so. I'm thinking, for example, of electric vehicles, battery integration of renewables into the system. And here, policy can do a lot to support that, be it with deployment policies, as we have it for renewables, but also with technology support policies, which might also increase the competitiveness of some regions of the European Union vis-à-vis the rest of the world.
Georg has written extensively about the EU's emission trading scheme. We asked him about the future of cap-and-trade policies.
The EU should definitely work on repairing this European emission trading system and making it again a model for the world, because having a general budget for carbon for the entire economy helps a lot to reduce the cost of decarbonization for the entire system.
And what about other regions of the world? The EU has traditionally seen itself as a leader on climate change, but is this position under threat? We asked Simone about global challenges.
Europe has been a leader over the last decade as far as the fight against climate change is concerned, and I think that this role of leadership was also demonstrated last year in Iran to the Paris COP21 conference. because last year we can well argue that Europe was a fundamental element in bringing about the consensus to reach the agreement that was reached in Paris. So yes, Europe still has a leading role. However, we also see that other countries are emerging as front runners in the fight against climate change. And this is somehow exemplified by the ratification process of the Paris Agreement, where we saw that China and the United States, for instance, were very quick in ratifying the agreement itself. It means that these countries are committed to their decarbonization targets, but it also means that countries, for instance, like China, see an economic opportunity in decarbonization.
That brings us to the end of this episode. It's clear that decarbonisation is a priority for economic policymakers across Europe and around the world. But there are many challenges ahead. International coordination, integrating new technologies, and making sure that emissions trading really works.
Thanks for listening to The Sound of Economics. If you are interested in more Bruegel work on energy and climate policy, there is a range of blogs and papers by Simone and Georg available on our website at www.bruegel.org. You will also find video recordings of relevant events, including the panel at this year's annual meetings where Laszlo Vara and Connie Hedegaard participated. We hope you'll join us again for The Sound of Economics. See you next time.